Has any book ever been set to music as many times as the Book of Psalms? The art of psalmody is nearly 3,000 years old, and some of these ancient melodies have survived to this day. In the Catholic Church, the Gregorian chant for Psalm 114, known as the Tonus Peregrinus, sounds like this. In exitu Israel de Egypto, domus Jacob de populo barbaro. And the ancient synagogue cantillation of the same text, but in Hebrew, sounds like this. Betzes Israel mimitzrayim, beis Yaakov meyam loes. Is that a coincidence, or does it suggest that the two melodies have a common origin, some 2,000 years ago, before the Christian church split from its Jewish origins? It's impossible to say for sure, but let's listen to these two sacred psalmodies alternating back and forth. We will then follow that with a modern work based on that same chant.
Sicut a mio virus.
Good. All right. So, hello, Paul, and hi, Sean. So good of you to be with us. I'd like to talk to you about your wonderful composition, The Lord's Wonders at the Exodus. And we'll start with the question, what inspired you to compose this work and why this particular psalm?
Well, I'm pretty sure I found the tune. It was a period of time when Sean and I were working together. I was directing a community youth chorus in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and at that time he was my accompanist. And we had this kind of, I don't know, we were just young and curious. And so we explored a lot of things. And often I would just bring stuff into rehearsal and teach it to the kids. And then Sean would sit at the piano and make up something.
Huh.
And a lot of what we did, some of it worked out really well, and I think a lot of it didn't. A lot of it went on the musical scrap heap, never to be seen or heard from again. But this piece, it kind of did work. I'm remembering it was in the 90s, and there was this period of time in the 90s when chants became like the rage. Everyone was recording chants and everyone was listening to chants and, like it was new. And of course it wasn't. It was the opposite of new, but it was this sort of chant renaissance period. And so we did a lot of chants during that time. This was one of the chants that we played with during that time. And Sean sat at the piano and came up with what he comes up with, which always I'm going like, dude, how do you think of this stuff? Sean, did you have was there any particular genesis for the accompaniment that you remember?
I was thinking about that today because it's been a long time since I thought about that piece, like in detail. And I actually put it on today and I listened to it again. And I do remember that at the time I was listening to, one of the things that was in my ear was Grand Pianola Music by John Adams, which is this big symphonic work for 2 pianos and full orchestra, which is just, it's like arpeggios zooming up and down the keyboard. And, it was sort of pseudo minimalist music. So a lot of repeating patterns and a lot of sort of hypertonal, like staying very stable in a couple of keys. And I know that I was listening to a lot of that back then and just that was coming out. And because chant, I think it lends itself to that sort of, I don't know, simple harmonic progressions, but the motion of arpeggios or repeated rhythmic patterns was just in my ear at the time. Yeah, it was always improvised. Like I didn't write it down until my wife had to play it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
An interesting thing about this process, so Sean and I were in rehearsals together 2 or 3 days a week, and this process of just sort of creating stuff on the fly became part and parcel of who we were. So Sean and I had done this piece with our chorus in Grand Rapids, and then we went and did like a summer vocal camp with kids in Princeton, New Jersey. And of course, we just took whatever we had done the previous year at home, because we were really there to have a good time, not to, create a whole new repertoire. And
go to New York.
So we wanted to go to New York. So we did this piece there on one of the concerts. And then I got back to Grand Rapids at some time in the fall, and I had a message that someone had called me, and it said that it was the mother of Allison Miller, and I knew that she was a kid at the camp. She had been there. So I returned the call, and she says, so this piece that you did, that was a very nice piece, and I was wondering if you could send me the music to it. And I said, this is the part that's just, we were so young. And Oh no, we don't give our music away. We just do what we want to do. We don't just give our music away. And the woman on the other end of the line said, oh, well, that's very sad. I wanted to conduct it at the National Conference of the American Choral Directors Association this spring. And I went, who are you? It was Judith Willoughby. And I didn't know her then. And Judith and I became very close, and I consider her one of my two principal musical mentors at this point in my life. But at the time, she was just calling me on the phone and asking for this song, and I'm like, and then she said that, and I went, what are you talking about? And so then she and I talked, and I told her that it wasn't written down, which was always a problem with anything Sean and I were doing. It wasn't written down. The first things we had published with Earth Songs. Earth Songs wanted to publish it, and I'm like, well, it's not written down. And I remember Ron Jeffers said, well, if I mail you a pad of staff paper, do you think you could write it down? And I went, well, I guess we could. Anyway, so it wasn't written, it wasn't notated at all. And Judith said that if I would send her a recording, she would notate it. And I think I mailed a cassette tape from Michigan to Pennsylvania, and she did. And my guess is that that is where you, Joshua, heard the piece performed in obviously not the first time you'd heard the tune, but my guess is that that's where you heard it.
Did you, it's the Tonus Peregrinus, as you know, and were you aware that it had a brother or a sister in the Jewish tradition that is almost identical, using the same psalm but with the Hebrew text? And then the other question is, when did you add the soprano saxophone and the percussion parts?
I think I became aware. I think that when we first started doing it, I was not aware that it was that old and that it had come really pretty literally straight out of Hebraic chant. I mean, I was aware that this was a thing in music history that had happened to some degree or another. But I think and remember, it's 30 years ago, and I'm not for sure, but I think when we first started doing it, I think I probably referred to the Liber and subsequently became aware. I'm not altogether sure. It may have even been you, Josh, that made me aware. I'm not sure. It was so long ago. So the percussion came because I had bought these beautiful goat bells from India that hung in my house, and they had the most gorgeous sound, and I still have them. And anytime that I do this piece, I grab those bells because they're just, and it was luck. The reason we put the bells in is because I had them. Yeah, and so we had this friend who was a regular collaborator, and he ended up basically being on stage with me every time that he was available for probably the next 15 or 20 years until I moved to Seattle. I was still using Ed. If Ed was available, Ed was on my gig because he could add saxophone to anything and make it elegant, you know?
Yep.
The inspiration for wanting to add saxophone to this piece, though, it came from that recording by Jan Garbarek called Officium. Sean and I were obsessed with that recording. I bought a ridiculously expensive stereo system because Sean and I went to the store and listened to that CD on those speakers, and I said, sold. Had that stereo system until maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago. That Jan Garbarek caused us to fall in love with soprano saxophone, and he was on that recording. He was improvising on top of polyphony. So I guess we fancied ourselves, Jan Juniors. I don't know, and I just want your audience to know that this world of choral music is a much better richer and more informed place because you were always the person, and are still the person we can go to. And anyway, I wanted to thank you for that, and I wanted your audience to know how far your reach extends beyond what they see and hear. Thank you so much for doing it.
All right.
That's great.
It's wonderful to see you both.
Likewise.